At my own birthday brunch, my grandfather lifted his glass with a warm, proud smile and said how thrilled he was that I loved the downtown penthouse he'd bought for me. I just stared at him, completely frozen, and finally whispered that I actually lived in a flooded basement. My father's fork slipped straight out of his hand, clattering against his plate, and the entire room dropped into a dead, suffocating silence as a $1 million lie came apart right there at the table. My name is Riley. I'm 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated scapegoat of my family. I work 70 hours a week as a freelance user experience designer, surviving purely on caffeine and stubbornness, while my parents treat me like some embarrassing secret they'd rather not explain to their friends. Before I get into the rest of this, drop where you're watching from in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to wreck your life for their own benefit. I grew up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, where appearances were absolutely everything to my parents. My father, Richard, runs a mid-tier logistics company and carries himself like corporate royalty, even though the company is nowhere near as impressive as he pretends. My mother, Linda, spends her days at the country club obsessing over designer labels, tennis lessons, and whatever gossip keeps her social standing intact. From the moment I chose to study digital design instead of corporate law or finance, they decided I was a failure. Full stop. Every ounce of their praise, affection, and financial support went straight to my younger sister Madison instead. At 30 years old, Madison holds a completely fake advisor title at our father's company, a role that requires her to do essentially nothing while she collects a fat six-figure salary for it. She's married to Terrence, a smooth-talking man who proudly calls himself a tech startup founder. In reality, Terrence just burns through investor money on projects that never actually launch and never will. Together, they're the golden couple my parents parade around at every high society event, while I get shoved into the background like an inconvenient footnote to the family story. The confrontation that finally shattered our family's carefully built illusion happened last Sunday. My grandfather, Harrison, had flown in all the way from Florida to celebrate my 33rd birthday. Grandpa Harrison is a retired real estate mogul, sharp as a tack, a man who built an entire empire out of absolutely nothing. He's the only person in our whole extended family who has ever genuinely respected my independence and my work ethic. Because he was footing the bill, my parents happily booked a private dining room at a wildly expensive Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Chicago. I showed up straight from a brutal client deadline, running on fumes, but genuinely happy to finally see my grandfather again. I was wearing a simple navy dress I'd owned for about 3 years, and honestly, I thought I looked perfectly professional. My mother, Linda, took one look at me the second I walked through the heavy oak doors and let out an exaggerated, theatrical sigh. She leaned across the table, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly against her champagne flute. "Riley, darling," she said, deliberately loud enough for the hovering waiter to hear every word. "Did you really have to wear that tired old rag to a place like this? I offered to take you shopping last month. You look like you crawled straight out of a discount thrift store." I swallowed my anger, took a slow breath, and calmly explained I'd been working back-to-back shifts and hadn't had a spare minute to go shopping for luxury clothes. Madison rolled her eyes and deliberately repositioned her brand-new designer bag on her lap, angling it so everyone at the table could clock the logo. "That's exactly the problem with being a freelancer," Madison sneered, sipping her mimosa. "You have zero stability. Terrence just closed another round of seed funding for his app. We're actually thinking about upgrading our cars next week. Success is really about having a winner's mindset, Riley. You should try it sometime." Terrence smirked, swirling his expensive scotch in slow circles. He spent the next 20 minutes bragging endlessly about his imaginary tech empire, throwing around words like valuation metrics and disruptive paradigms, while my father nodded along like Terence was the greatest genius of our entire generation. I sat quietly, sipping my ice water, already numb to this exact toxic performance. I was living in a cramped, damp basement apartment out in the far suburbs, paying $1,200 a month for a place with plumbing that constantly leaked, forcing me to shove old towels under the front door every time it rained. But it was mine, and I paid for it myself, and that hard-earned independence was the only thing keeping me sane through all of this. Eventually, the plates were cleared, and the waiter wheeled out a beautiful chocolate cake. Grandpa Harrison smiled warmly, his sharp eyes crinkling at the corners, and stood up slowly, tapping his water glass gently with a silver spoon. The whole table went quiet instantly, everyone eager to hear the family patriarch speak. "I want to make a toast to my wonderful granddaughter Riley on her special day," he began, his voice full of a genuine warmth I rarely heard from anyone else at that table. "You've always been such a hard worker, you forged your own path, and you've never once asked anyone for a handout. That kind of grit and resilience is incredibly rare these days." A heavy lump formed in my throat. It was the first genuinely kind thing anyone had said to me all year. My grandfather kept his eyes locked on mine. "And that's exactly why I set up that trust fund for you," he continued. "I know how brutal the freelance world can be, and I wanted to make absolutely sure you always had a safe, comfortable place to call home. I'm so happy you're enjoying that downtown Chicago penthouse I bought you 3 years ago. At least you never have to worry about rent while you're out there building your business." The whole room froze. The silence was so sudden, so total, that the soft jazz playing in the background suddenly sounded almost deafening. I stared at my grandfather, completely baffled, my mind racing to make sense of words that simply did not match my reality. Trust fund, downtown penthouse. 3 years ago. None of it lined up with anything I actually knew about my own life. "Grandpa," I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "What penthouse? I don't have a trust fund. I've been renting a flooded basement apartment out in the suburbs for $1,200 a month." The color drained instantly from my father's face. His fork hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, echoing clatter that seemed to bounce off every wall of that private dining room. My mother looked like she'd seen a ghost, her jaw practically hanging open. Madison suddenly found her lap fascinating, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, while Terence went rigid in his chair, his smug little smirk vanishing into thin air. Grandpa Harrison's eyes narrowed. That warm, grandfatherly expression disappeared in an instant, replaced by the ruthless real estate tycoon who had crushed competitors for decades. He looked at my parents, then back at me. "What do you mean you live in a basement?" he demanded, his voice dropping into something dangerous and cold. "I personally authorized the release of $1.5 million from your trust to purchase that exact penthouse on Michigan Avenue. Richard handled every piece of the closing paperwork for you." My father started stammering, sweat beading visibly on his forehead. "Dad, let me explain," he stuttered, hands raised defensively. "There was a complication with the property taxes, and Riley just wasn't ready for that kind of financial responsibility. We made a strategic family decision." Grandpa Harrison didn't even let him finish the sentence. He pulled his phone from his suit jacket and dialed a number with furious precision, then slammed it onto the center of the table and hit speaker. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Vivian Cole, trust and real estate attorney. How can I help you, Harrison?" My grandfather leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. "Vivian, I need you to pull up the official deed for the Michigan Avenue penthouse right now. Tell me exactly who's listed as the legal owner of that property." We sat in agonizing silence for 10 long seconds while Vivian typed rapidly. Then the clicking stopped. "The property is currently registered to Terrence and Madison," Vivian announced through the speaker. "Would you like me to send over the documentation?" The blood drained out of my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. He didn't even wait for the call to end before shoving his chair back so violently it tipped over onto the carpet with a heavy thud. Before I could even process the size of the betrayal that had just been laid bare, my mother grabbed my left arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. My father came around the table and seized my right arm in a bruising grip. Together, they practically dragged me out of the dining room, down the dim hallway, and shoved me straight into the empty women's lounge. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the jazz music completely. I stood there rubbing my aching arms, staring at the two people who were supposed to protect me. Instead of an apology, my mother rounded on me in a fury, chest heaving, finger jabbing at my face. "How could you do this to us, Riley?" she hissed, pacing across the marble floor. "You just humiliated this entire family in front of your grandfather. Could you not just play along for one single dinner? You always have to ruin everything with this dramatic victim complex of yours." I stared at her, stunned by the sheer nerve of that accusation. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. "You stole a $1.5 million penthouse that Grandpa bought for me," I fired back, my voice echoing off the tile. "You committed literal fraud, and somehow you're mad at me for not playing along with your own crime." My father stepped forward, looming over me the same way he loomed over his warehouse employees. "It was a strategic family decision," he barked, as if that corporate phrase somehow excused a felony. "Terrence is on the verge of a massive round of seed funding. He needs to host investors somewhere with real prestige. He needs the optics of success to close this deal. Investors don't hand millions of dollars to a guy living in some basic suburban apartment. We put the penthouse in Madison and Terrence's names because they actually need the high society image to secure their future. You just sit behind a screen designing websites all day. You don't need a luxury address to freelance." The cruelty of his logic hit me like a punch to the gut. They had stolen my inheritance to fund my brother-in-law's fake billionaire lifestyle. "So Terrence gets to play successful tech founder using my stolen property," I said, voice shaking with pure rage. "And what about me, Dad? What about my life? I've been drowning in $60,000 of student loan debt for 10 years. I work 70 hours a week just to make minimum payments on loans you forced me to take out because you claimed you couldn't afford my tuition." My mother rolled her eyes, arms crossed. "We told you a digital design degree was useless. We were teaching you financial responsibility. You needed to learn how the real world actually works." "Financial responsibility?" I practically screamed, years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. "When Madison graduated with a completely useless art history degree, you bought her a brand new sports car as a gift. You paid for her $100,000 destination wedding in cash. You gave her a fake advisory title at your company so she could collect a huge paycheck for doing absolutely nothing. And you left me to rot in a flooded basement while you handed her my $1 million home." The door swung open and Madison marched in, and she did not look guilty. She looked profoundly annoyed that her perfect evening had been interrupted, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "You're being completely unreasonable," Madison sneered, stepping right up to me. "Terrence and I are building an empire. We're creating generational wealth for this whole family. You're just being selfish because you're jealous of our success and our marriage." "Your success is literally built on a stolen apartment," I shot back, refusing to back down from her condescending glare. Madison let out a dramatic sigh and unzipped her designer bag, pulling out a sleek checkbook and a gold-plated pen. She scribbled something down fast, ripped the check free, and flung it at my chest. It fluttered down onto the wet marble near my cheap shoes. "There's $10,000, she said, dripping with superiority. Go buy yourself some new clothes and pay off a chunk of your pathetic little student loans. Consider it a generous gift. Now wipe your face, walk back out to that table, and tell Grandpa Harrison you willingly transferred the deed to us because you couldn't afford the maintenance fees. Fix this right now, or I swear to God, Dad will use his connections to make sure you never land another freelance client in this city again. They all stared at me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to lower my head, pick up the money, and fold, the way I'd been conditioned to do my entire life. To swallow the blame for their behavior and say thank you for the scraps. I looked down at the $10,000 check sitting in a puddle of water. Then I looked at my mother, my father, and the golden child sister who had stolen my entire future without a shred of remorse. I bent down slowly and picked up the piece of paper. Madison smirked, clearly certain she'd just won. Instead of thanking her, I gripped both edges of that check and tore it straight down the middle. Then again, and again, until it was nothing but confetti. I threw the shreds directly into Madison's perfectly contoured face. Before she could even react, I grabbed a heavy glass tumbler off the vanity, full to the brim with iced lemon water meant for lounge guests, and threw the entire thing straight into her face. She shrieked as the icy water wrecked her makeup and soaked through her silk blouse. My mother screamed and lunged for a towel while my father shouted my name in pure fury. I didn't stay to hear their empty threats. I turned on my heel and walked out, head high, spine straight, and marched back down the hallway toward the private dining room, fully prepared to tell my grandfather the entire ugly truth about what these people had done to me. But when I got there, the room was empty. Untouched plates of food still sat on the table, but Grandpa Harrison was gone. Terrence was nowhere to be found either. The only thing left on the table was the black leather check presenter. I walked over to it, my heart pounding against my ribs. Tucked beneath the metal clip was a single crisp white napkin, and on the back of it, in my grandfather's sharp, unmistakable handwriting, was a short message. I grabbed my coat, packed up my things, and read the note one more time just to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. It was perfectly clear, and it signaled the complete unraveling of my family's fraudulent little empire. It simply said, "See you in federal court." The next morning, I walked into a downtown high-rise, my cheap boots sinking into the plush carpet of the most intimidating law firm in Chicago. The glass double doors read, "Cole and Associates," in sharp silver lettering. I hadn't slept a single minute since walking out of that restaurant. My mind kept replaying my father's smug speech about strategic family decisions, my mother's nails digging into my arm. I was running purely on black coffee and adrenaline, but I kept my back straight as the receptionist led me down a long hallway overlooking the city skyline. Vivian Cole was waiting in a corner office that radiated pure authority. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire annual rent. She didn't offer me sympathy or soft platitudes about how hard family drama could be. She simply pointed me toward a heavy leather chair across from her desk, already stacked with neat piles of financial documents and legal binders. "Your grandfather called me the moment he walked out of that restaurant yesterday," Vivian said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "He's authorized this firm to use its full weight to dismantle whatever fraudulent structure your parents have built. We are not treating this as a family dispute, Riley. We are treating this as a hostile corporate takeover." She slid a thick manila folder across the desk. "Open it." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder and looked at the top document. A standard real estate transfer form, officially moving the deed of the Michigan Avenue penthouse out of my trust fund and into the names of Madison and Terrence. It was stamped, notarized, and legally binding. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. "Look at the bottom of the second page," Vivian instructed, tapping her pen against the paper. "Look at the authorization signature." I flipped the page and stared at the ink. There, right above a printed line with my full legal name, was a signature. It was close to my handwriting. The same sharp loops, the same slight slant. But it wasn't mine. I traced my finger over the ink, nausea washing over me. "I didn't sign this," I whispered. "I've never even seen this document before in my life." Vivian nodded, her expression hardening into something predatory. "I know you didn't sign it," she said, "because doing so would have required an override authorization to bypass the strict stipulations built into the trust your grandfather set up. Your parents couldn't simply call the bank and ask for the deed to be transferred. They needed absolute legal authority to act on your behalf." She slid a second document across the desk, right beside the fraudulent transfer. "This is a durable power of attorney," Vivian explained. "It was filed exactly 3 years ago, right around the time the trust released the funds for the penthouse." I read through the legal language, my chest tightening with every line. The document handed my father complete control over my financial decisions, real estate holdings, and trust fund allocations. It effectively declared that I had voluntarily surrendered my financial autonomy to him. And there, at the bottom, notarized and officially filed with the state of Illinois, was yet another forgery of my signature. "They forged my name so my father could take total control over my life," I said, the full weight of the crime finally landing. "My own parents forged a legal document just so they could steal an apartment and hand it off to my sister." Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands. "They didn't just forge a document, Riley. They engaged in a calculated, multi-state criminal conspiracy. Your grandfather's trust is based in Florida. The property sits in Illinois. Transferring $1.5 million across state lines using a forged power of attorney isn't a simple civil issue. That's federal wire fraud. That's identity theft. That's a serious felony that carries mandatory prison time." The words echoed in my skull. Federal prison. My parents had been so consumed by keeping up a fake high society image, so determined to prop up Terrence and Madison, that they'd casually committed a federal crime, risked everything just to make sure their golden child could play house in a penthouse while I drowned in a flooded suburban basement. "We're going to file a civil suit to contest the deed immediately," Vivian continued, her eyes locked on mine. "But I'm also putting together a full dossier for the FBI. Your father thinks his logistics company and his country club connections make him untouchable. We're going to show him exactly what happens when you commit federal fraud against a trust managed by this firm." A fierce wave of vindication rolled through me. For 33 years, I'd been told I was the failure, gaslit into believing my own struggles were somehow my fault. But I wasn't the failure. They were the criminals. Vivian turned to her monitors, fingers flying across the keyboard. "As part of my preliminary review this morning, I ran a title search on the penthouse to check for outstanding liens," she said, eyes scanning the screen. "I wanted to make sure Madison and Terrence hadn't racked up unpaid property taxes we'd need to clear once we seized the place back." She stopped typing abruptly. The predatory confidence on her face shifted into pure disgust, and she let out a short, cynical laugh. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "What did they do?" Vivian turned the monitor toward me. "They didn't just steal the penthouse to live in it, Riley. Your brother-in-law is even more tangled up in this than we thought. He's been using the stolen property as his personal ATM." I stared at the financial records on the screen, struggling to process what I was reading. It was a commercial loan agreement filed with a major national bank. Terrence had used the $1.5 million penthouse as direct collateral to secure an enormous business loan. "He leveraged your stolen property to take out an $800,000 loan," Vivian said, pointing to the highlighted figure. "He told the bank he owned it free and clear and used it to raise capital for his non-existent tech startup. Your sister and her husband are sitting on an $800,000 powder keg, and they're funding their entire lifestyle with your stolen inheritance." 48 hours after that meeting, I was sitting on the edge of my thrifted mattress in the freezing dampness of my basement apartment, my laptop screen glowing in the dark, casting a harsh blue light across my exhausted face. I was pushing through the final beta version of an interface for my highest-paying corporate client, a project that was supposed to carry my finances for the entire year. Then a notification pinged. An email from the client's director of operations. Subject line: contract termination. My heart lurched. I opened the message and scanned the cold, legally sanitized language explaining that they were immediately severing ties with my agency due to unforeseen internal restructuring. Before I could even absorb the loss of a $20,000 project, a second email landed from a different client. Same script, word for word: contract canceled, services no longer required. In the span of about 3 minutes, my entire projected income for the next 6 months evaporated into thin air. My phone buzzed against the cheap particle board desk, and the caller ID showed my father's name. Richard never called during business hours unless he wanted to berate me or squeeze a favor out of me for Madison. I swiped to answer, my hand shaking with a mix of dread and adrenaline. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice flat. A low, arrogant chuckle came through the line. "I assume you've checked your email by now," Richard said, his tone dripping with the same smug satisfaction he usually saved for crushing business rivals. "You did this," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a full, cold realization of exactly how malicious my own father could be. I did what any protective father would do when an ungrateful daughter tries to destroy her own family. He snapped. "You really thought you could hire some fancy downtown lawyer and go to war with us without consequences? I run a major logistics firm, Riley. I play golf with the CEOs of the exact companies you beg for freelance scraps. It took me 2 phone calls to dry up your entire revenue stream." I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "You're intentionally starving me out," I whispered, sickened by the sheer calculation behind it. "I'm teaching you a much-needed lesson about loyalty and hierarchy," he shot back. "Here's the deal. You call off your little attorney right now and drop this ridiculous lawsuit. You sign an NDA stating the penthouse belongs to Madison and Terrence. You walk away quietly, and maybe, I make another call to get your contracts reinstated. If you refuse, I will personally make sure you're blacklisted across the entire design industry. You'll never land another freelance client in this state again. You'll drown in that student loan debt until they repossess whatever's left in that flooded basement of yours." He paused, clearly expecting me to break, waiting for the muffled sobs, the desperate apologies I'd been trained to offer since childhood. Instead, a wave of cold, absolute clarity washed over me. "You think cutting off my money is going to make me submit to you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a slow, steady whisper. "You think I'm going to roll over and let you keep a stolen $1 million just so I can keep designing websites for your corrupt country club friends?" Richard scoffed. "You have zero leverage, Riley. No money, no clients, no power. Don't be stupid." "I'll see you in federal court, Dad," I said and hung up. I set the phone down and stared at the bare concrete wall of my apartment. Panic clawed at my throat. Rent was due in 5 days. My loan servicer was already sending warning notices. I had exactly $400 left in my checking account, and Vivian needed a serious retainer to fast-track both the civil litigation and the federal filings. Richard had calculated my financial ruin down to the dollar, banking on the idea that poverty would force my surrender. He had badly underestimated the survival instincts of a woman who had been fighting for herself since the day she turned 18. I didn't cry. Crying was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I grabbed my keys, shoved my laptop into my worn backpack, and walked out to the muddy driveway where my 10-year-old sedan sat waiting. It was a battered, dependable car I'd paid off myself in my early 20s, my only real asset besides the stolen trust fund. I drove straight to a used car dealership on the edge of the city. No haggling, no negotiating. I slapped the title on the salesman's desk and demanded a straight cash buyout on the spot. 2 hours later, I walked out with a cashier's check for $8,000, leaving my only car behind in their back lot. I took the city bus all the way downtown, rain pouring down and soaking through my thin jacket by the time I reached the glass tower housing Cole and Associates. I bypassed the receptionist entirely, marching straight down the hallway with total focus, and pushed open the door to Vivian's office. She looked up from her monitors, taking in my soaked clothes and the fire burning behind my eyes. I walked straight to her desk and slapped the $8,000 check down onto the polished mahogany. Richard just used his corporate network to kill both of my top contracts, I said, voice steady with lethal determination. He thinks starving me out will kill the lawsuit. He thinks I'm paralyzed. Vivian glanced at the check, then back up at my face. A slow, predatory smile spread across her lips. She recognized a fighter when she saw one. Take the money, I told her, holding her gaze. Don't wait on the standard civil summons. I want you to skip the slow route and hit them exactly where it hurts. File the emergency asset freeze against Terrence right now. Shut down every bank account tied to that penthouse, cut off the oxygen to his fake startup, and freeze every dollar he stole out of my inheritance. Let my father see exactly what happens when he tries to starve out a woman who already knows how to survive in the dark. That night, I sat on the edge of my thrifted mattress in my freezing basement apartment, watching pure delusion play out live on my laptop screen. Madison was broadcasting on Instagram from inside the $1.5 million Michigan Avenue penthouse, dripping in excess. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms moved through the open-concept living room, carrying silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Chicago skyline, a breathtaking view that had been legally paid for by my grandfather's trust, while my sister twirled in a silk designer dress, a glass of sparkling wine in hand. "Welcome to our official housewarming and seed funding gala," Madison squealed into her phone's microphone, her flawless smile masking the total fraud underneath it. She swung the camera around to Terrence, immaculate in a tailored charcoal tuxedo, standing near the custom marble kitchen island as he pitched his imaginary startup to a group of wealthy, unsuspecting investors. He waved his hands, throwing around empty buzzwords about disrupting the digital landscape, and the investors nodded along, hypnotized by the illusion of wealth the penthouse gave off. Terrence was using my stolen home as bait to trick venture capitalists into handing over their money. A new photo appeared on Madison's feed, a perfectly staged family portrait, Richard and Linda standing proudly beside Terrence and Madison in front of the penthouse fireplace, my parents beaming with pure arrogance. The caption underneath read, "Family is the ultimate foundation." So incredibly blessed to celebrate my brilliant husband and our beautiful new home. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for always supporting our massive dreams. I slammed my laptop shut, a bitter laugh tearing out of my throat. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the enormous legal iceberg Vivian Cole was already dragging straight into their path. I grabbed my heavy backpack and headed right back to the downtown law firm. I'd barely slept in days, but the adrenaline surging through me made me feel almost invincible. When I walked into Vivian's corner office, Grandpa Harrison was already there, sitting rigid in a leather guest chair, spine straight, eyes burning with a terrifying, quiet fury. He had refused to fly back to Florida, insisting on staying in Chicago until he personally watched my parents' fraudulent house of cards come crashing down. Vivian stood by the window, reviewing a fresh stack of documents delivered by the forensic accountant she'd hired. She turned as I walked in, that predatory smile back on her face. "The emergency asset freeze was approved by the federal judge exactly 20 minutes ago," Vivian announced, her voice ringing with cold satisfaction. The banks have officially locked down every account tied to Terrence and Madison. Their credit cards will start declining before they've even finished serving dessert at that ridiculous pitch party. I let out a long breath, feeling the first real wave of triumph settle over me. But Vivian held up a hand, signaling she wasn't finished. The smile faded, replaced with something colder, a look of pure disbelief. When we subpoenaed the financial records to execute the freeze, the forensic accountant uncovered something completely absurd. Vivian continued, walking back to her desk. We already knew Terrence took out an $800,000 commercial loan using your stolen penthouse as collateral. What confused us was how he'd managed to avoid defaulting on a debt that size. Terrence has zero legitimate income. His startup generates no revenue. The interest payments on a high-risk commercial loan like that are astronomical. The bank should have foreclosed on the penthouse months ago. Grandpa Harrison leaned forward, both hands braced on the head of his cane. So how exactly has that fraudster kept the bank off his back? Vivian slid a printed financial ledger across the desk toward me. I looked down at the highlighted columns, a series of frantic, oversized wire transfers landing in Terrence's business account on the first of every single month. I traced the routing numbers back to their source, my chest tightening as the pathetic, ugly truth clicked into place. My parents, I whispered, staring at the statements in disbelief. They've been doing a lot more than just paying it, Vivian corrected sharply. Your father's logistics company has been hemorrhaging money for 2 straight quarters. He didn't have the liquid cash to cover Terrence's debt. So Richard and Linda quietly liquidated their entire retirement accounts, drained every penny they'd saved for their old age. When that money ran out 3 months ago, they took out a second mortgage on their own house just to keep the cash flowing to Terrence. I stared at the paperwork, genuinely mesmerized by the scale of their stupidity. My parents, the same people who had lectured me endlessly about financial responsibility, who had mocked me viciously for taking out student loans to pay for my own education, had quietly bankrupted themselves. They'd torched their entire financial future just to keep alive the fantasy that Madison had married a successful tech founder. They threw away their whole retirement just to keep up appearances, Grandpa Harrison said, disgust dripping from every word. They're funding a sinking ship so they can brag about it at the country club. Vivian tapped the frozen account notices. And now that the federal judge has frozen Terrence's accounts, the bank is going to immediately realize the collateral is tied up in a fraud investigation. They'll call in the entire $800,000 loan on the spot. Terrence can't pay it back. Richard and Linda have no retirement funds left to bail him out. I looked over at the printed photo of Madison's Instagram post sitting on Vivian's desk. Family is the ultimate foundation. They were throwing a lavish party, sipping expensive champagne, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already collapsed. They weren't building an empire. They were all sitting together on a ticking time bomb, and the timer had just hit 0. The private elevator glided silently up to the top floor of the Michigan Avenue high-rise. I stood between Vivian Cole and 2 broad-shouldered Cook County Sheriff's deputies. My heart kept a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were perfectly still. The paralyzing fear that had governed my entire life was gone, replaced by an armor of cold, absolute certainty. The elevator chimed and the brushed steel doors slid open onto the private foyer of my stolen penthouse. The double doors leading into the main living space were propped wide open to accommodate the caterers. A wave of loud, arrogant laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes rolled over us. I stepped through the entryway, my cheap boots sinking into an imported Persian rug my sister had undoubtedly bought with stolen money. The penthouse was packed, Chicago's elite in bespoke suits and designer silk, milling through the vast open-concept living room. At the center of it all, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline, stood Terence, holding court with a cluster of older, wealthy-looking men, gesturing wildly as he pitched his non-existent startup. My parents stood nearby, practically glowing with borrowed pride. And there was Madison, decked out in a diamond necklace, wearing a smug proprietary smile, balancing a silver tray of appetizers. She spotted me instantly. The smugness drained out of her face, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. She shoved the tray into a passing waiter's hands and marched straight toward the entryway, heels stabbing the hardwood. "What the hell are you doing here?" Madison hissed, keeping her voice low so the investors wouldn't hear. "I told you to stay away from us. You are not ruining Terrence's pitch because you're jealous and broke. Get out of my house before I call building security." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I simply moved aside and let the two uniformed deputies step fully into the light of the entryway. The sight of the badges and utility belts sent an immediate ripple of shock through the nearest guests. The polite networking chatter died down fast, replaced by tense, murmuring confusion. My parents noticed the shift instantly and pushed through the crowd, color draining from their faces the second they saw the police escort beside me. "Officer, there's been a massive misunderstanding," Richard said, instantly slipping into his authoritative executive voice, trying to physically block the deputies from stepping farther in. "This is a private corporate event. My daughter is emotionally disturbed and prone to these kinds of dramatic outbursts. I'll handle her right now. Just step outside, and I'll have the building manager clear this up." The lead deputy didn't even blink at my father's condescending tone. He looked straight past Richard and locked eyes on Madison. "Are you Madison?" he asked, his voice booming over the soft background music. Madison swallowed hard, eyes darting frantically toward Terence, who had stopped mid-pitch and was staring at the doorway in total shock. "Yes," she stammered, arms crossing defensively. "I'm the owner of this property." "No, you're not," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy red seal of a federal judge. I walked straight past my father, ignoring his desperate grab at my arm, marched to the massive custom marble kitchen island, swept a tray of expensive caviar onto the floor with the back of my hand, and slammed the documents down onto the stone. "This is a court-ordered emergency eviction notice," I announced, staring straight into Madison's panicked eyes. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack whatever cheap clothes you actually paid for yourself and get out of my property. The locks get changed Tuesday morning. Anything left inside goes straight into a dumpster." Terence rushed over, his charismatic founder facade completely shattering. He forced out a loud laugh and turned back to his bewildered investors. "Just a little family drama, gentlemen. Please enjoy the champagne. My sister-in-law has a history of mental health struggles." He reached out to grab the eviction notice, but Vivian Cole stepped right up to the marble island and slapped her hand down over the paperwork, stopping him cold. "I would highly advise against touching that document," she said, her voice dropping the room's temperature by a good 10 degrees. Vivian turned her back on my family and faced the room full of wealthy investors, standing tall, a legal shark who had finally cornered her bleeding prey. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your evening," she projected, commanding the full attention of every billionaire in the room. "My name is Vivian Cole. I'm the lead trust and real estate attorney for Cole and Associates. I strongly advise all of you to set down your drinks and exit this premises immediately." The investors exchanged alarmed glances, their instincts immediately picking up on the danger in her tone. "The man you know as Terence is currently the subject of an active federal fraud investigation," Vivian continued, delivering the fatal blow without a hint of mercy. "This penthouse was stolen from my client through forged legal documents and identity theft. Furthermore, Terrence has illegally used this stolen property as collateral to secure commercial loans for his fraudulent startup. Terrence let out a choked gasp, hands flying to his head as he stumbled backward. Richard and Linda looked like they might faint right there on the Persian rug. Madison began to hyperventilate, clutching her diamond necklace as if it could somehow shield her from what was coming. "I'm warning all of you right now," Vivian said, scanning the terrified faces of the angel investors. "Any capital injected into this fake company will be instantly flagged by the federal government as participation in a criminal conspiracy. The bank accounts tied to this man were frozen by a federal judge less than an hour ago. Hand him a single dollar, and you're subjecting yourselves, your companies, and your personal assets to a full-scale IRS audit and a subsequent FBI investigation." The mere mention of the letters IRS and FBI landing in a room full of wealthy businessmen had an instantaneous, devastating effect. It was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. The investors didn't ask a single follow-up question. They didn't wait for Terrence to explain or defend himself. They dropped their champagne flutes onto the nearest tables and scrambled for the front door in a blind panic, shoving past my screaming mother and my frozen father, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal fraud case. Terrence lunged forward and grabbed the sleeve of an older investor rushing for the exit. "Wait, please, it's a lie. I have the pitch deck. I have the metrics." The investor violently yanked his arm free. "Don't ever contact me or my firm again," he snarled, disgusted. "You're a complete liability." Within 90 seconds, the sprawling luxury penthouse was completely empty of guests. The catered food sat untouched. The champagne went flat. The only people left in the room were the two deputies, my ruthless lawyer, and my thoroughly ruined family. Their fake empire had just burned to the ground, and the fire was only just getting started. The heavy doors of the penthouse stood wide open, framing the devastation we'd just unleashed. I didn't leave right away. I stood next to Vivian Cole, watching the glorious, catastrophic collapse of the people who had treated my life like disposable garbage. The silence left in the investors' wake was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Madison hyperventilating on the Persian rug. Then Terrence's phone started ringing. The sharp, obnoxious corporate ringtone echoed through the massive living room. Terrence stared down at the device like it was a live grenade. He swiped it with trembling fingers and pressed it to his ear. I watched every last drop of color drain out of his face. His jaw went slack. His eyes went wide with sheer terror. The voice on the other end was loud enough that I could catch the sharp, aggressive tone even from several feet away, a senior executive from his commercial bank. The automated federal asset freeze had triggered a massive internal alarm across the entire lending department, and the bank had just discovered that the primary collateral behind Terrence's $800,000 loan was now classified as stolen property under active federal investigation. "No, listen to me, you can't do that," Terrence begged, voice cracking with desperation. "I just need 48 hours to restructure the capital. I have investors lined up. We're finalizing the term sheets right now." The banking executive didn't care about his lies. The voice on the line delivered the fatal blow, officially calling in the entire balance of the commercial loan, effective immediately, citing severe breach of contract and suspected criminal fraud. The bank was seizing whatever digital funds remained and initiating immediate legal action to recover the rest. The line went dead. Terrence lowered the phone, hands shaking violently. The polished tech founder facade didn't just slip. It shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a primal, deafening roar of rage, spun around, and hurled his phone directly at the floor-to-ceiling window. It shattered against the reinforced glass, raining plastic and metal shards across the hardwood floor. Madison screamed, covering her face as Terrence completely lost his mind, grabbing a tray of half-empty crystal flutes off the kitchen island and sweeping it violently onto the floor. Glass exploded everywhere. He kicked over a velvet bar stool, sending it crashing into the custom cabinetry. His billion-dollar startup, his entire fake identity, had just been vaporized in a single phone call. Terrence spun toward my parents, chest heaving, and pointed a trembling, accusing finger at my father. "You told me the paperwork was bulletproof," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "You swore to me that forged power of attorney was completely untraceable. You said you had total control over her trust fund, and that no one would ever question the deed transfer. You promised me this collateral was entirely safe." Richard took a frightened step back, hands raised in a pathetic attempt to calm his enraged son-in-law. "Keep your voice down, Terrence," he hissed, glancing nervously at the two deputies watching the entire meltdown with their hands resting casually on their belts. "We can fix this. I have lawyers. I have connections. We just need to assess the damage and put together a strategy." "Fix this?" Terrence shrieked, taking an aggressive step toward my cowering father. "There is no fixing this. The bank just called in an $800,000 loan. The federal government has frozen my accounts. The IRS is going to tear my entire life apart. I'm looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary because you and your greedy wife couldn't even forge a document correctly. You guaranteed me this address so I could secure funding, and now I'm completely ruined." Linda burst into loud, theatrical tears, clinging to Richard's arm. Madison scrambled to her feet and tried to grab her husband's shoulder. "Baby, please, calm down," she sobbed, her diamond necklace glittering mockingly against her ruined silk dress. "We'll figure it out. My parents will sell their house. They'll bail us out." Terrence shoved her hand away in disgust. "They don't have a house anymore, you idiot," he spat, exposing the final, humiliating truth to the whole room. "They took out a second mortgage just to pay the interest on my loan. They liquidated their entire retirement. Your parents are just as broke and pathetic as you are. I am done with this entire fraudulent family." I turned to Vivian, a cold, satisfied smile touching the corner of my mouth. We'd seen enough. The infection was finally killing the host. I thanked the deputies for their service and walked out of my own penthouse, leaving my family trapped in the burning wreckage of their own unmatched greed. The eviction notice gave them 48 hours to vacate. But Terrence had no intention of sticking around to face the consequences. The cowardice that had defined his entire existence took full control over the next 12 hours. He knew federal authorities would be coming for him next. He knew the bank would seize every tangible asset he owned to cover the defaulted loan. While Madison spent the whole night locked in the master bathroom, sobbing hysterically on the marble floor and frantically calling her parents for a bailout that was never coming, Terrence quietly, ruthlessly dismantled their shared life. He didn't pack his clothes or his useless business documents. He packed survival capital. Working in total silence, he stripped the penthouse of every high-value item he could easily liquidate, emptying Madison's jewelry box of diamond tennis bracelets, gold watches, and platinum rings my parents had foolishly gifted her over the years. He packed up the expensive electronics, the limited edition sneakers, and cleared out a hidden safe containing $20,000 in emergency cash that was supposed to be their safety net. He stuffed it all into a duffel bag, fully planning to pawn it on the black market to fund his escape from federal jurisdiction. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye to the woman he'd promised to build an empire with. When dawn broke over the Chicago skyline, casting a cold gray light through the massive penthouse windows, Madison finally emerged from the bathroom, eyes red and swollen. She called out for her husband, expecting comfort, expecting him to have some magical fix for their sudden poverty. The apartment was dead silent. She walked into the master bedroom and found the jewelry boxes emptied out across the unmade bed, the safe hanging open, completely cleaned out. Terrence had vanished into thin air with everything of value, leaving his pampered, delusional wife entirely abandoned. Madison collapsed onto the floor of the empty, echoing apartment, alone with absolutely nothing left to her name but an impending federal indictment and an eviction notice bearing my signature. The torrential Chicago rain pounded relentlessly against the tiny ground-level window of my basement apartment. I sat at my cheap particle board desk, wrapping both hands around a steaming mug of black coffee, listening to the storm raging outside. It had been exactly 72 hours since I'd walked out of that stolen penthouse and left my family to suffocate in the smoke of their own burning empire. The federal asset freeze had triggered a massive chain reaction, and local news networks were already reporting on a sweeping federal investigation into a prominent logistics executive. My phone had stayed completely silent, protected by a new number and strict blocking protocols. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a real, untouchable sense of peace. Then a frantic, aggressive pounding echoed down the concrete stairwell to my front door. I set my coffee down, the dark liquid rippling from the vibrations. Nobody knew my address except Grandpa Harrison and Vivian Cole. I walked slowly toward the entryway, the cold linoleum biting into my bare feet, and peered through the foggy peephole. Standing on the flooded concrete landing, completely drenched by the freezing downpour, was my mother. Linda was almost unrecognizable, the woman who religiously attended country club luncheons and obsessed over a flawless, wealthy image looked utterly destroyed. Her expensive beige trench coat was soaked through and clinging to her shaking frame. Her salon-highlighted hair was plastered flat against her skull, and dark streaks of ruined mascara ran down her pale cheeks like dirty river water. She was shivering violently, clutching her leather handbag to her chest as the storm battered her without mercy. I unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open a few inches, keeping the heavy brass chain firmly engaged. Freezing wind whipped into the hallway, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and pure desperation. "Riley!" my mother gasped, grabbing the edge of the doorframe with white-knuckled fingers. "Thank God you're here. Please, you have to let me inside. I'm freezing." I didn't move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, blocking the entryway, looking down at the woman who had happily financed my sister's lavish lifestyle using my stolen identity. "Why are you here, Linda?" I asked, my voice completely stripped of warmth. My mother let out a loud, pathetic sob and did something I never thought I'd witness in my entire life. She collapsed onto the muddy, flooded concrete landing, dropping to her knees in the freezing rain, ruining her designer clothes, burying her face in her hands as she wept. "The FBI raided your father's logistics company this morning," Linda wailed, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Dozens of federal agents stormed the headquarters. They confiscated every computer, every hard drive, every financial ledger. They dragged Richard out of the boardroom in handcuffs right in front of his entire executive staff. He's sitting in a federal holding cell right now, Riley. They're charging him with wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. The bank is moving to foreclose on our house by the end of the month because the asset freeze blocked our mortgage payments. We have nothing left. She reached out, mud-streaked hands grasping blindly at the hem of my jeans. "You have to call your lawyer and stop this," Linda begged, her voice climbing into a shrill, frantic pitch. "You have to drop the civil suit and tell the federal prosecutors this was all just a family misunderstanding. I carried you for 9 months, Riley. I gave birth to you. I raised you. I am your mother. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. Families forgive each other. You have to show some mercy before they take everything away from us." I stared down at her trembling, pathetic form. The rain kept washing violently over her, but I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no leftover childhood instinct to comfort her. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 33 years was dead, buried under the crushing weight of $60,000 in student debt and the blatant theft of my grandfather's trust. "Mercy," I repeated softly, the word tasting like ash. Did you show me any mercy when I was drowning in debt, working 70 hours a week just to keep the lights on in this miserable, flooded basement? Did you show me mercy when you forged my legal signature to steal a $1.5 million penthouse so Madison could play rich? Did you think about family loyalty when you sat in that Michelin-starred restaurant and publicly called me a worthless failure in front of our entire extended family? Linda choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically. "We made a mistake," she cried, ignoring the rain hammering her face. "We were just trying to help Terrence secure his business funding. We were protecting the family's image. I'm begging you, Riley. I'll be homeless. I'll have to sleep on the street. Please, you have to save us." "You didn't make a mistake," I said, my voice slicing through the storm with surgical precision. "You made a highly calculated, malicious choice. You weighed my life against Madison's vanity, and you happily threw me to the wolves. You built a fraudulent empire on my back, and now that the foundation has completely collapsed, you want me to shield you from the debris." I reached into the front pocket of my cardigan. I'd picked up a stack of mail earlier that afternoon, and I remembered exactly what was sitting on top of the pile. I pulled out a glossy trifold brochure and slid it through the narrow gap in the doorway. It fluttered down and landed in the muddy puddle beside her bruised knees. Linda stared at it, tear-filled eyes struggling to make out the bold print in the dim light. It was an informational pamphlet for a county-subsidized low-income housing program and emergency homeless shelter located in the city's industrial district. "What is this?" my mother whispered, her voice trembling with a fresh, horrifying realization. "You spent my entire life telling me my dreams were stupid," I said, staring directly into her broken, terrified eyes. "You constantly told me I needed to grow up, stop playing on computers, and be realistic about my financial situation." I gripped the heavy brass handle of the door, preparing to shut her out of my life for good. "Well, Mom," I said, delivering the final blow without a hint of hesitation, "I'd highly suggest you take your own advice. Be realistic about your new living arrangements." I slammed the door shut, twisted the deadbolt firmly into place, and walked back to my coffee, leaving her alone to drown in the storm she'd created. Terrence had convinced himself he could outsmart the federal government. After fleeing the penthouse with a heavy duffel bag stuffed with stolen jewelry, luxury watches, and whatever cash he could scrape together from the hidden safe, his grand escape lasted exactly 48 hours. He was apprehended by law enforcement at O'Hare International Airport while frantically trying to board a one-way flight to a country with no extradition treaty. Now he sat in a freezing, windowless interrogation room at the FBI field office in downtown Chicago, while two stern federal agents laid out devastating evidence against him across a cold metal table. The commercial bank fraud documents, the severe wire fraud charges, the flight to avoid prosecution paperwork. All clinically outlining a potential 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Terrence was, at his core, a profound coward who had built his entire adult identity on the fragile illusion of wealth and unearned status. Faced with the harsh, undeniable reality of a concrete cell and a stainless steel toilet, his loyalty to Madison and her manipulative family evaporated instantly. He looked at the agents, hands shaking uncontrollably in his lap, and begged to know what kind of deal they could offer him to save his own skin. The lead agent smiled coldly. They didn't just want the fake startup founder. They wanted the arrogant mastermind who had orchestrated the fraudulent transfer of the trust fund in the first place. They wanted Richard. To secure a meaningfully reduced sentence, Terrence eagerly agreed to wear a concealed recording device, quickly turning into an active, willing informant for the federal government, fully prepared to stab his wealthy in-laws in the back to preserve his own freedom. The FBI carefully arranged for Terrence to meet with my father, under the strict premise of coordinating their shared legal defense strategy. Richard, still operating under a delusion of invincibility after posting an exorbitant bail following the initial residential raid, agreed to meet Terence at a quiet, dimly lit steakhouse on the industrial edge of the city. He arrogantly assumed Terence was coming to beg for a coordinated legal bailout. When Terence slid into the leather booth across from his father-in-law, he was sweating through his shirt. A tiny, high-definition microphone was taped securely beneath his tailored dress shirt, transmitting every breath and nervous tremor directly to an FBI surveillance van parked 2 blocks away in a quiet, darkened alley. Richard looked at Terence with pure, unfiltered disgust, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He immediately launched into a tirade, berating Terence for panicking, calling him weak and incompetent for letting the commercial loan default so quickly. Terence swallowed hard, fighting down his rising panic, and forced himself to remember the exact script the federal agents had drilled into him. He needed a direct, unequivocal confession to save himself from decades behind bars. Terence leaned across the polished wooden table, keeping his voice low and appropriately frantic. "They're threatening to pin the entire forgery operation on me, Richard," he whispered, playing the desperate, terrified man perfectly. "The bank's telling federal investigators that I personally orchestrated the deed transfer to secure my loan. You have to tell them I had nothing to do with the actual paperwork. You promised me the asset was completely clean. I just signed the loan papers. I never touched the trust fund documents." Richard scoffed loudly, taking a long, arrogant sip of bourbon. His legendary ego, the same toxic pride that had driven him to ruin my life and steal my inheritance, completely overrode whatever common sense he had left. "You spineless idiot," Richard hissed, leaning in closer, entirely oblivious to the federal microphone sitting inches from his mouth. "You actually think the federal government believes a failed, bankrupt startup founder could bypass a heavily secured, million-dollar real estate trust on his own? I handled the entire transfer from start to finish. I personally drafted and printed the durable power of attorney. I sat at my home office desk and forged Riley's signature with my own 2 hands. I practiced her handwriting for hours until it was flawless." He leaned back against the booth, radiating smugness. "I took that forged document to the company notary the very next morning and made them stamp it. I handed you the keys to the kingdom, Terence. I gave you $1 million asset on a silver platter, and you blew it because you couldn't manage to pay interest on a simple commercial loan. Just do exactly what my lawyers tell you. Keep your mouth shut, and I'll make sure we all walk away from this intact." 2 blocks away, in the cramped surveillance van, the federal agents pulled off their headphones and immediately started making urgent calls to the federal prosecutor. They had their smoking gun, a direct, voluntary, crystal-clear confession to identity theft, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy, all captured on tape. The very next morning, Richard walked into the glass-walled boardroom of his logistics company, wearing his best-tailored power suit, radiating an aura of unshakable confidence as he addressed his nervous board of directors. Standing at the head of the long mahogany table, he launched into a grand, sweeping speech about corporate resilience and navigating minor legal misunderstandings, desperately trying to reassure his wealthy shareholders that his leadership was secure and the company's stock wouldn't take a hit. He raised both hands to emphasize a point about future revenue projections. He never got to finish the sentence. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom were shoved open violently, shattering the polished corporate calm. A tactical team of federal agents in bulletproof vests emblazoned with bright yellow lettering stormed the room. The lead agent walked straight past the gasping, terrified board members and marched directly up to my father, a heavily stamped legal document gripped firmly in his hand. Richard's face went completely gray, every trace of arrogance draining away as the agent slammed the search warrant down onto the mahogany table, officially announcing that his corporate empire was about to be dismantled piece by piece. The federal raid on Richard's logistics company was the final nail in the coffin of my family's fraudulent little empire. But my sister Madison was a creature built entirely on public perception and social validation. With her husband sitting in a freezing federal holding cell and our father facing serious felony charges, Madison had nowhere left to run and no stolen money left to hide behind. She was cornered, humiliated, and desperate to reclaim control of the narrative. So she reached for the only weapon still in her manipulative arsenal: social media. Less than 24 hours after the FBI stormed the boardroom, my phone started vibrating violently on the kitchen counter. Not one or two notifications, but a relentless flood of alerts that made the device overheat in my hand. I opened my main social account and found myself tagged in thousands of comments. Madison had uploaded a heavily produced, heavily filtered video to her sizable following. She was sitting on the floor of her childhood bedroom in our parents' suburban mansion, dressed in an oversized beige sweater, looking disheveled and fragile, tears streaming down her face as she stared into the camera and played the ultimate victim. "My older sister Riley has completely destroyed our family," Madison sobbed, her voice trembling with rehearsed devastation. "She has always been fiercely jealous of my happiness and my marriage, but I never thought she'd stoop to elder abuse to get her sick revenge. She has completely isolated our sick, elderly grandfather. She manipulated his declining mental state, brainwashing him into believing horrific lies about my husband and my parents. She used his wealth to freeze our bank accounts and illegally evict me from my home right after I had a baby. She is stealing his fortune while his mind slips away, and she's sending my innocent father to prison to cover her tracks." The video was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. Madison weaponized the internet perfectly, painting me as a greedy, sociopathic monster exploiting a helpless senior citizen. Within hours, the video went massively viral, the algorithm pushing it out to millions of strangers who thrive on quick digital outrage. My inbox was instantly paralyzed under a tidal wave of hatred. Hundreds of strangers called me a gold digger, a sociopath, a criminal abuser. Distant relatives who hadn't bothered to speak to me in a decade suddenly resurfaced, leaving vicious voicemails demanding I release my grandfather from my toxic control. They threatened to report me to Adult Protective Services. They threatened to torch my freelance business with fake, ruinous reviews on my professional website. The internet mob was hungry for blood, and Madison had served me up on a silver platter. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't respond to one hateful comment or try to defend myself in the replies. Arguing with a digital mob is always a losing battle. Instead, I simply screen-recorded Madison's slanderous little video, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to Vivian Cole's downtown office. When I walked into her corner office, Grandpa Harrison was already there, sipping black coffee while reviewing a stack of civil litigation paperwork. I walked to the mahogany desk, set my phone down in front of him, and hit play. Grandpa Harrison watched the entire video without blinking. He listened to Madison cry fake tears and boldly announced to the world that his mind was slipping. He listened to his favorite spoiled granddaughter publicly declare him a weak, senile old man incapable of managing his own finances. The silence in the office afterward was genuinely terrifying. Grandpa Harrison didn't yell, he didn't throw anything. The legendary real estate tycoon simply finished his coffee, set the porcelain cup down with deliberate care, and looked at Vivian with a gaze cold enough to freeze the ocean. "Vivian," he said, quiet but ringing with lethal authority, "call your best videographer. Get them up to this office right now. I'm going to remind my arrogant family exactly who holds the power in this bloodline." Within 60 minutes, a professional camera crew had set up in the middle of the law firm, lighting sharp and immaculate. Grandpa Harrison sat behind the massive mahogany desk in a tailored navy suit, radiating an aura of terrifying dominance. He looked straight into the lens, and the recording began. My name is Harrison, and I'm speaking directly to the millions of people who recently watched a slanderous video posted by my granddaughter Madison, he said, his voice crystal clear and undeniably strong. Madison claims that my mind is failing. She claims I'm being manipulated and abused by her sister Riley. Let me assure every one of you, I have never been more lucid, more furious, or more aware of the sheer greed infecting my own bloodline. He reached to his right and picked up a thick stack of medical documents bearing the official seal of the state's most prestigious neurological institute, slamming the file down onto the desk hard enough to crack through the audio feed. These are comprehensive, court-certified cognitive evaluations conducted by 3 independent board-certified neurologists, a $1.5 million property from my trust using forged federal documents. They committed massive financial fraud, and now they're crying on the internet because I caught them red-handed. He leaned forward, commanding the frame, preparing to deliver the final blow to my father's arrogant legacy. To my son Richard, who let this criminal behavior flourish under his own roof, hear me clearly, Grandpa Harrison declared, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. You are a disgrace to our family name. Effective immediately, I am legally severing all ties with you. My attorneys have already finalized the paperwork. I am permanently striking you, your wife Linda, and your daughter Madison from my last will and testament. You will not receive a single cent of my fortune. You are entirely dead to me. Good luck in federal court. The fluorescent lights of the downtown legal deposition room hummed with a sterile, suffocating energy. I sat perfectly still at the massive mahogany conference table, hands folded neatly in my lap. A certified court reporter sat in the corner, fingers hovering over her stenography machine, ready to permanently record the total unraveling of my father. Richard looked entirely unrecognizable. The arrogant, untouchable executive who had mercilessly mocked my freelance career just weeks earlier was completely gone. His tailored suit hung loosely off his dramatically thinned frame. His skin looked sallow, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He sat beside a highly paid defense attorney who already looked defeated before the questioning had even begun. My father was currently out on federal bail, facing serious criminal charges. But today's session was about the civil litigation, about stripping away every single lie he'd ever told. Vivian Cole sat beside me, radiating the terrifying calm of an apex predator circling wounded prey. She adjusted her legal binder, picked up a pristine silver pen, and looked straight into my father's terrified eyes. Please state your full legal name for the record, Vivian ordered, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. Richard swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. Richard Thomas Anderson, he muttered, barely above a whisper. Vivian didn't waste a second on pleasantries. She slid a clear plastic folder across the table, holding a high-resolution copy of the forged durable power of attorney. Mr. Anderson, I'm showing you Exhibit A, she said, tone sharp and unrelenting. Do you recognize this document? It's a legal authorization filed with the state of Illinois, granting you complete financial control over your daughter's trust fund. Do you confirm you personally submitted this paperwork to the bank holding the Michigan Avenue penthouse deed? Richard's defense attorney raised a hand. My client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination regarding the origins of that specific document. Vivian smiled a thin, predatory smile. That's perfectly fine, counselor, because we already have the federal wiretap transcripts where your client explicitly bragged to his son-in-law about forging that signature with his own 2 hands. We don't need him to confess to the forgery today. We need him to explain the malicious intent behind his financial terrorism. Richard flinched hard at the mention of the wiretap. The realization that Terrence had betrayed him to the FBI was clearly still an open, bleeding wound. Vivian leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. You were a wealthy man, Mr. Anderson, or at least you used to be. Your logistics company generated millions last year. You lived in a sprawling suburban mansion. You had access to massive lines of corporate credit. So tell me, why orchestrate a highly illegal multi-state federal fraud scheme to steal a property from your own flesh and blood? Why not simply take out a legitimate business loan to fund Terrence's startup? I was protecting my family, Richard snapped, a sudden flash of his old arrogance flaring up. I was managing our assets. Terrence needed the right optics to secure his venture capital. It was a temporary reassignment of property. We were going to put it back in her name eventually. Vivian slammed her hand flat on the table, the sharp crack making Richard physically jump. Do not insult my intelligence, and do not lie under oath in this room, she commanded, voice ringing with lethal authority. You drained your own retirement accounts. You took out a second mortgage on your own home just to pay the interest on a fraudulent loan. You were drowning in debt. You stole that penthouse because you were desperate to keep up a pathetic illusion of high society wealth. But out of everyone, out of all your wealthy country club friends, out of every corporate investor in your circle, why did you target Riley? The room went dead silent. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys. I stared straight at my father, refusing to look away. I wanted to hear him say it. I needed his cruelty on the official legal record, in his own words. Why, Riley? Vivian pressed, voice dropping into something dangerous and demanding. Why did you choose to financially execute your own eldest daughter? Richard's face contorted with a mixture of shame and uncontrollable rage. His attorney reached for his arm, silently pleading with him to stay quiet, but the psychological pressure had already broken him. Richard slammed his fists onto the table, eyes locking onto mine with burning, unapologetic resentment. I did it because I thought she was too weak, Richard screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure. I thought she'd just take it. She's always been quiet. She's always been a pathetic disappointment, living in some flooded basement. She spent her whole life begging for our approval. I chose her because I knew she didn't have the money to fight back. I knew she'd just cry and accept her place at the bottom of the family. I chose her because I never thought she'd dare sue her own family. The confession hung in the freezing air of the deposition room, the absolute, unvarnished truth. He had preyed on me because he thought my empathy was a weakness. He thought my desperate desire for a loving family made me an easy, disposable target. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a feeling of profound, glacial emptiness. You were wrong, Dad, I said, my voice steady, entirely without mercy. I am the strongest person in this room, and I'm the one who's going to bury you. Richard slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, face buried in his trembling hands. He had just handed us the exact motive we needed to destroy him in civil court and secure maximum punitive damages. His attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Well, Mr. Anderson, Vivian said, her tone returning to a terrifying, surgical calm. I appreciate your candor. However, there's one final item we need on the official record today. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a fresh, heavily redacted bank statement, sliding it across the table until it stopped directly in front of my father. Richard looked down, his exhausted eyes struggling to focus on the highlighted figures. While the FBI was seizing your corporate ledgers, my forensic accountants were digging into your wife's personal banking history, Vivian announced, her voice ringing with precision. We wanted to see exactly where the stolen funds were flowing before the federal freeze took effect. It turns out your wife, Linda, is not just a passive accessory to your criminal conspiracy. She's a highly active participant. Richard looked up, utter confusion twisting his face. What are you talking about? He stammered defensively. Linda had nothing to do with the transfers. I handled the trust fund. Vivian smiled, cold, and unforgiving. That's what you thought, Richard. But the banking records tell a very different story. Exactly 48 hours after you illegally transferred the deed to that penthouse, your wife initiated a secondary, unauthorized wire transfer. She secretly siphoned exactly $50,000 out of the stolen commercial loan funds. She didn't use it to pay the mortgage. She didn't use it to help Terrence's fake startup. Vivian leaned forward, delivering the final, relationship-shattering blow. Linda moved $50,000 of stolen money into a secret offshore shell account registered exclusively in Madison's name. Your wife and your golden child daughter were stealing from you while you were busy stealing from Riley. They used that stolen cash to fund a high-end designer shopping spree in Paris, while you sat here orchestrating a federal fraud scheme to protect them. Your perfect family has been robbing you blind this whole time. The atmosphere inside the sprawling suburban mansion had become completely suffocating. The custom-built house that had once served as the ultimate symbol of my parents' arrogance and social superiority was now an active crime scene of their own making. Following the disastrous deposition, the walls were closing in fast on Richard and Linda. The secondary mortgage they had recklessly taken out to cover Terrence's ballooning commercial loan interest had officially gone into default. Without the stolen trust money or the logistics company's revenue keeping them afloat, the bank moved with ruthless, mechanical precision. The grace periods had expired. The automated warnings had run out. The financial guillotine was dropping. Richard paced the length of the immaculate, formal living room like a trapped, feral animal. His federal bail conditions restricted his travel, and the crushing weight of the upcoming criminal trial was visibly wearing him down. He needed liquid cash, immediately. His high-priced defense attorney had already demanded a massive, non-refundable retainer the moment they walked out of Vivian Cole's deposition room. Without that money, the attorney threatened to formally withdraw from the case entirely, leaving Richard to face federal prosecutors with a randomly assigned public defender, a concept that terrified a man used to a lifetime of country club privilege. Linda sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands. The revelation of her secret offshore account during the deposition had shattered whatever was left of their marriage. Richard had screamed at her for hours after they got home, accusing her of hoarding stolen cash while he risked federal prison to protect her and their daughter. But the offshore account was already frozen by the authorities anyway, leaving them with nothing but the physical assets sitting untouched in their 4-car garage. "We still have the vehicles," Richard announced, his eyes suddenly darting toward the frosted glass of the garage door, as though the answer to everything lay behind it. "We have the brand-new Mercedes-Benz S-Class and your Range Rover. They're paid off, free and clear. We can call that luxury auto broker downtown, the one who offered me a direct cash buyout last year. We liquidate both vehicles today, secure the retainer for a defense attorney, and use whatever's left to rent someplace quiet and discreet until this whole federal investigation blows over." Linda looked up, her tear-stained face reflecting a pathetic, flickering glimmer of hope. She nodded frantically and grabbed her designer coat off the hook, the gesture as desperate and transparent as a drowning woman clutching at driftwood. They hurried toward the garage together, Richard already pulling his cell phone from his pocket to make the call that would supposedly save them from total ruin. They hit the electronic garage door opener. The heavy metal door groaned upward, revealing the manicured concrete driveway beyond. But the luxury auto broker was not the one waiting for them. 2 massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks sat backed into the driveway, their diesel engines rumbling low and steady in the otherwise quiet, affluent neighborhood. Standing directly in front of the vehicles were 4 agents in dark windbreakers, the bright, unmistakable yellow lettering of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division stamped across their backs. Richard's phone slipped from his fingers and cracked against the concrete. He lunged forward, arms flailing. "What are you doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You can't take those vehicles. That's private property. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. The lead IRS agent didn't so much as blink at my father's pathetic display of authority. He simply stepped forward and handed Richard a thick, heavily stamped federal warrant. "We have every jurisdiction, Mr. Anderson," the agent said, his voice utterly devoid of sympathy. "You are currently under federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft. You also carry massive unreported tax liabilities tied to the misappropriation of a highly regulated trust fund. The federal government has officially placed a comprehensive lien on all of your physical assets. These vehicles are being impounded by the Internal Revenue Service to cover mandatory restitution and pending penalties." Linda shrieked in absolute horror as the tow truck operators looped heavy chains around the axles of her beloved Range Rover. The metallic clanking echoed down the pristine suburban street. Wealthy neighbors began drifting out onto their porches, half hiding behind perfectly trimmed hedges, eagerly watching the spectacular, humiliating collapse of the neighborhood's most arrogant couple. Richard stood frozen on the driveway, his mouth opening and closing uselessly as he watched his last financial lifeline get dragged away down the street. But the universe wasn't finished with them yet. Before the tow trucks had even rounded the corner, a dark green Cook County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb, lights flashing ominously. Two uniformed deputies climbed out and walked purposefully up the long brick path leading to the mansion's massive front doors. Richard and Linda turned around, the blood completely drained from their faces. The lead deputy held up a brightly colored neon orange document. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," he announced loudly, clearly making sure the lingering neighbors caught every word. "The bank has officially finalized foreclosure proceedings on this property due to severe default on your secondary mortgage. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately." "We need time," Linda wailed, collapsing to her knees on the expensive brick walkway. "We have nowhere to go. You can't just throw us out into the street. We need to pack our clothes. You had 30 days of written notice, delivered via certified mail." The deputy replied coldly, stepping around her toward the heavy mahogany front door. "You have exactly 5 minutes to gather any essential medications and personal identification. Everything else stays inside to be auctioned by the bank." Richard and Linda stumbled blindly into the house, grabbing 2 garbage bags from the kitchen and frantically stuffing whatever basic clothing and toiletries they could find into the thin plastic. The deputies escorted them back out the front door exactly 5 minutes later. The heavy, definitive click of the deadbolt locking behind them sounded like a gunshot. The deputy slapped the neon foreclosure notice directly onto the beautiful mahogany wood, sealing their ruin completely. As my parents stood shivering on the front lawn, clutching black garbage bags stuffed with wrinkled clothes, an ordinary yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open and Madison stepped out onto the wet asphalt. My sister looked entirely destroyed, her hair a tangled mess, still wearing the same wrinkled silk designer dress from her disastrous penthouse party. Terrence had abandoned her completely, stealing every piece of jewelry, every watch, and every dollar of emergency cash they'd hidden in their safe. She'd begged the taxi driver to bring her out to the suburbs, fully expecting to run crying into the safe, wealthy arms of her powerful parents, expecting a warm bed, a hot meal, a financial bailout. Instead, Madison dragged her 2 massive, heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases up the driveway, her heels clicking unevenly against the pavement, and stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at the empty garage. She looked at the neon foreclosure notice taped across the front door. Finally, she looked at Richard and Linda, standing on the manicured grass clutching actual garbage bags, looking for all the world like vagrants. "Mom?" Madison whimpered, her voice breaking into a high, pathetic sob. "Terrence left me. He took everything. I need to come home." Linda stared at her golden child daughter, the daughter she had committed federal fraud to protect, the daughter she had sacrificed my entire life to elevate. A harsh, broken sob tore out of my mother's throat as the full reality of their situation finally crushed all three of them at once. "There is no home, Madison," Richard said flatly, staring at the cold, gray suburban street. "We have absolutely nothing left." The three of them stood frozen on the sidewalk, surrounded by the mocking stares of their wealthy former friends. No money, no vehicles, no shelter, no power left at all. The flawless, arrogant family that had once thrown me to the wolves without a second thought was now entirely homeless, shivering together in the cold, facing the exact same brutal, unforgiving reality they had forced me to survive my entire life. Terrence sat on the sagging mattress of a cheap, heavily stained motel bed on the industrial outskirts of Chicago. The room reeked of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach, a devastating downgrade from the $1.5 million penthouse he'd illegally occupied just weeks before. He stared at the heavily redacted federal plea agreement sitting on the cracked laminate nightstand. He had done exactly what the FBI demanded. He'd worn the concealed wire. He'd walked straight into that dimly lit steakhouse and manipulated Richard into a full, undeniable, recorded confession. He'd sold out his own arrogant father-in-law to save his skin, fully expecting the federal prosecutors to hand him absolute immunity in return. But the federal government did not hand out free passes for massive commercial bank fraud. His overworked public defender had called that same afternoon with the brutal reality. Prosecutors were recommending a mandatory 4-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. 4 years locked in a concrete cage. For a man who had built his entire existence on tailored suits, expensive champagne, and the fragile illusion of being a billionaire tech founder, 4 years was an absolute death sentence. Terrence understood, with crushing clarity, that his cowardice had only delayed his destruction, not prevented it. Raw, suffocating panic seized his entire body. He refused to wear a prison uniform. He refused to lose the best years of his life paying for a failed fraud scheme. He walked over to the cheap laminate dresser and unzipped a battered black duffel bag. Inside sat the last of his survival capital, a thick stack of $100 bills, cash he'd raised by pawning Madison's designer jewelry on the black market before the federal asset freeze fully locked down his digital footprint. Exactly $15,000 in untraceable currency, not enough to rebuild his fake empire, but more than enough to vanish. He reached into the front pocket of the duffel bag and pulled out a small, dark blue booklet. A highly sophisticated, extremely expensive forged passport, procured through a shady underground contact in the city. The document bore a completely different name and a different birth date, but featured his photograph, perfectly laminated onto the identification page. He'd spent days meticulously researching international extradition law and had purchased a one-way first-class ticket to a remote island nation that flatly refused to cooperate with the United States Department of Justice. Once his plane touched down on that tropical runway, the FBI, the commercial bank, and his ruined, homeless in-laws would never be able to touch him again. Terrence traded his usual tailored suit for a nondescript gray hoodie and a dark baseball cap, pulling the brim low over his eyes to hide his face. He grabbed the heavy duffel bag, left the motel room key on the bed, and walked out into the freezing night air. He paid a random taxi driver in pure cash, instructing him to take the longest, most roundabout route possible toward Chicago International Airport. The international terminal was a chaotic, swirling ocean of frantic travelers, blaring intercom announcements, and rolling luggage. Terrence stepped out of the taxi, collar pulled up against the biting wind, head down, blending into the exhausted crowd of tourists and business executives. Walking past the ticketing counters, he felt a sudden, intense surge of his old toxic arrogance flood back into his veins. He was actually going to pull this off. He'd outsmarted the ruthless federal prosecutors. He'd sidestepped Vivian Cole and her predatory legal tactics. He was going to leave his penniless, pathetic wife crying in some suburban street while he sipped cocktails on an untouchable beach. He navigated the winding security maze with practiced ease, clutching his fake passport and boarding pass tightly in his sweating hand. The line crawled forward, agonizingly slow, every second heightening the massive adrenaline spike pounding in his chest. He could see the final security checkpoint just a few yards ahead, the Transportation Security Administration officers routinely scanning documents and waving passengers through the metal detectors. Terrence stepped up to the designated podium. He forced his facial muscles to relax, painting on the charming, disarming smile he'd once used to swindle countless angel investors, and handed his forged blue passport to the uniformed officer behind the thick plexiglass shield. The officer didn't smile back. He took the document, swiped it through the digital scanner, and glanced briefly at the monitor. "Please look directly into the camera lens for the biometric facial recognition scan, sir," the officer instructed, his voice flat and mechanical. Terrence swallowed hard. He stepped onto the yellow footprints painted on the linoleum floor and stared into the small, glowing green camera lens mounted above the podium, holding his breath, waiting for the familiar, comforting chime of approval. He was already mentally preparing to grab his duffel bag and sprint toward his departure gate. The machine didn't chime. Instead, the glowing green light flashed instantly to a violent, blinding red. A sharp, high-pitched digital alarm buzzed across the officer's secure monitor. Terrence felt his stomach drop clean out of his body. The officer's eyes widened as he read the urgent red text flashing across his screen. The biometric scan had bypassed the fake name on the forged passport entirely and matched Terrence's facial structure directly to a high-priority federal flight risk database. "Sir, I need you to step to the side," the officer commanded, his hand already dropping to the radio clipped to his shoulder. Terrence did not step to the side. Pure, unadulterated terror hijacked his brain. He yanked his hand back, left the fake passport lying on the podium, and turned to run. He shoved a middle-aged woman out of his path, wildly attempting to sprint back through the crowded security line toward the terminal exit. He didn't make it 5 feet. Before Terrence could even process the incoming threat, 4 heavily armed Customs and Border Protection officers swarmed him from every direction. A massive, muscular officer tackled him violently from behind, driving him face-first into the hard, polished airport floor. The impact knocked the wind clean out of his lungs. "Stop resisting," an officer roared, pressing a knee aggressively into the center of Terrence's back. Terrence gasped for air, his face crushed against the cold tile, as cold steel handcuffs snapped brutally tight around his wrists, completely immobilizing his arms. Hundreds of shocked passengers gasped and pulled their children back, forming a wide, terrified circle around the violent apprehension. Dozens of smartphone cameras instantly turned toward him, recording his absolute, miserable downfall. "You are in direct violation of a federal travel ban," the lead officer shouted, hauling Terrence roughly to his feet by the back of his gray hoodie. "You're under arrest for attempting to flee federal prosecution, possessing fraudulent identification documents, and violating the strict terms of your bail agreement." Terrence's legs gave out entirely. He went completely limp, his arrogant founder facade shattered into 1,000 pathetic pieces. The officers dragged him through the crowded, brightly lit terminal, while hundreds of strangers watched in absolute silence as the fake technology genius was hauled away in cold steel chains, his desperate, cowardly escape annihilated by the very digital technology he'd once pretended to have invented. The massive oak doors of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse swung shut with a heavy, echoing thud that signaled the absolute end of my parents' reign. The courtroom itself was a freezing, cavernous space lined with dark wood and dominated by the intimidating seal of the United States government. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by my grandfather Harrison on one side and my ruthless attorney Vivian Cole on the other. Across the aisle at the defense table, sat Richard and Linda, completely stripped of their former country club arrogance. My father wore a cheap, wrinkled suit, a far cry from his tailored executive wardrobe. My mother sat beside him, her face pale, her once expensive highlights fading into dull gray roots. The federal prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a voice like shattering glass, stood before the jury box and didn't waste a single breath on pleasantries. She methodically painted a devastating portrait of unparalleled greed, walking the jury through the forged, durable power of attorney, the illegal transfer of the Michigan Avenue penthouse, and the coordinated wire fraud that had crossed state lines. She displayed bank records showing how my parents had drained their own retirement accounts to fund Terrence and his fraudulent commercial loan. The jury listened in stunned silence as she described how a supposedly wealthy, respectable logistics executive had systematically plotted to financially destroy his own eldest daughter, all to preserve a pathetic illusion of high society status for his favored child. Then the bailiff called my name. I stood, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored charcoal blazer, walked past the wooden swinging gate, and stepped up into the witness box. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. The microphone picked up the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. For the very first time in my 33 years of life, I was looking down at my father from a position of absolute, undeniable power. Richard stared up at me from the defense table, trying to muster that old, terrifying glare, the exact look he'd used when I was a teenager asking for help with college tuition. He wanted me to cower. He wanted me to remember my place at the bottom of his twisted family hierarchy. I did not break eye contact. I stared back at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a Chicago winter, and watched his fragile, arrogant facade crack right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. The prosecutor approached the podium and asked me to state my name and my relationship to the defendants. She asked me to describe the exact moment I learned my signature had been forged to steal a $1.5 million trust fund asset. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying across the massive room without a single tremor. I recounted the birthday brunch at the Michelin-starred restaurant. I described how my mother had viciously mocked my cheap clothes while I was secretly living in a flooded, moldy basement apartment. I explained how they had dragged me into a public bathroom and threatened to destroy my freelance design career if I didn't hand over my stolen inheritance to Madison and Terrence. I laid out every detail of their cruelty, their emotional manipulation, and their relentless exploitation. I told the jury exactly how it felt to work 70 hours a week, burning my eyes out in front of a computer screen, while my parents bought my sister a brand new sports car and a six-figure destination wedding. I explained how they'd conditioned me to believe I was a profound disappointment simply because I'd chosen to build my own independent design business instead of conforming to their shallow corporate expectations. The courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors openly glared at Richard and Linda. My mother buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing quietly, but it was far too late for theatrical tears to save her. When the prosecutor finished, Richard's desperate defense attorney approached the podium for cross-examination, sweating heavily, aware his client stood on the edge of a federal cliff. He tried the only pathetic strategy he had left: brutal character assassination. "You claim your parents abandoned you financially?" he began, raising his voice to sound intimidating. "But isn't it true, Riley, that you're simply a bitter, ungrateful child? Isn't it true that you grew jealous of your sister's successful marriage and decided to weaponize a simple family misunderstanding to steal your parents' hard-earned wealth? You're trying to send the people who raised you, fed you, and housed you to a federal penitentiary, just because you want a bigger piece of the pie." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show a flicker of anger. I simply looked at the desperate lawyer with something close to pity. Before I could even answer, the federal prosecutor stood, holding a massive, meticulously organized digital file that Vivian Cole had personally handed over to the government. "Objection, Your Honor," the prosecutor announced. "The defense is deliberately mischaracterizing the financial relationship between the witness and the defendants. We request permission to enter Exhibit F into the official record." The judge nodded. The projector screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life, displaying a comprehensive audit of my entire banking history stretching back exactly 15 years. The prosecutor walked up to the jury box. "Let the record reflect the truth," she declared, pointing sharply at the glowing screens. "These are the certified financial records of Riley Anderson since the exact day she turned 18. Look closely at the incoming transfer columns. There is not a single dollar, not 1 cent, transferred from Richard or Linda Anderson. The witness paid her entire $60,000 college tuition by working double shifts as a waitress and taking on predatory student loans. She has paid every rent check, every grocery bill, and every medical expense with money she earned entirely on her own. Her parents didn't just cut her off financially. They actively stole from her to fund their preferred daughter." The defense attorney froze at the podium, mouth hanging open, staring at the undeniable, monumental proof of my absolute independence. The entire narrative he'd tried to spin evaporated into thin air. Richard buried his face in his hands, completely broken. Linda let out a loud, pathetic wail. The jury looked at the screens, then looked at my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. I sat in the witness box, breathing the cold, sterile air of the courtroom, knowing with absolute certainty that I had just nailed the lid of their coffin shut. The jury's deliberation was agonizingly short. A federal jury doesn't need days when it's handed an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable paper trails, blatantly forged signatures, and crystal-clear wiretap confessions. The heavy oak door of the deliberation room swung open less than 4 hours after they'd retired. The 12 men and women filed back into the freezing, cavernous courtroom, their faces unreadable, deliberately avoiding even a second of eye contact with the defense table. I sat perfectly still in the front row, flanked by Harrison and Vivian. The suffocating silence in the room was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, ordered the defendants to rise and face the jury box. Richard stood on trembling legs. The tailored designer suit he'd worn so arrogantly on the first day of the trial was now visibly wrinkled, reeking of stale sweat and unadulterated panic. Linda clung desperately to his arm, openly sobbing, her expensive makeup ruined and running down her pale cheeks. The court clerk took the verdict form from the jury foreman and began reading the absolute, unequivocal destruction of my parents' lives directly into the microphone. "On the charge of federal wire fraud, we find the defendant, Richard Thomas Anderson, guilty. On the charge of aggravated identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty." The word guilty echoed through the massive chamber like a relentless mechanical hammer, driving a coffin nail deeper with every strike. My father's face drained of all remaining color, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Terrence hadn't been standing at that particular defense table that day, but his miserable fate had already been sealed earlier that same week, in a separate but deeply connected proceeding. Despite his desperate, cowardly attempt to play the victim and wear a federal wire to rat out my father, the prosecutors hadn't let him walk away clean. His commercial bank fraud was simply too severe to ignore. Terrence had been handed a solid 4-year sentence in a federal correctional institution, permanently annihilating his fake billionaire startup founder persona. He was already sitting in a concrete cell, entirely stripped of his tailored tuxedos, his stolen Rolex watches, and his fraudulent identity. Now it was Richard and Linda's turn to face the music. The federal judge adjusted his glasses and stared down from the bench at my parents with a look of profound, visceral disgust. "In all my years on the federal bench," he began, his voice laced with venom, "I have presided over highly complex corporate embezzlement cases and massive, multi-million-dollar financial schemes. But the sheer malicious cruelty on display in this courtroom over the past week is genuinely breathtaking. You did not simply defraud a financial institution. You financially executed your own flesh and blood. You stole her rightful inheritance to fund a shallow, pathetic illusion of high society wealth. You weaponized your parental authority to commit severe federal felonies against a daughter who owed you absolutely nothing." Richard flinched as if physically struck across the jaw. He opened his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but the judge raised a hand, instantly silencing him. Without hesitation, the judge continued. "Richard Anderson, for the crimes of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, I sentence you to 60 months, exactly 5 years, in a federal penitentiary. There is no parole in the federal system. You will serve every single day of that sentence behind bars." Richard's knees buckled completely. Two massive United States Marshals stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom, grabbing his arms and restraining him before he could collapse onto the polished wooden floor. The sharp, heavy click of cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around my father's wrists echoed through the room. The judge turned his furious, unyielding gaze on my mother. "Linda Anderson, due to your lack of prior criminal history and your secondary accessory role in the actual forgery, you will narrowly avoid a prison cell today. I sentence you to 3 years of strict federal probation and 1,000 hours of mandatory supervised community service. If you violate a single minor term of this probation or attempt to contact the victim, you will immediately join your husband in federal custody." Linda let out a horrific, piercing wail, sinking back into her heavy wooden chair and burying her face in her shaking hands. She wasn't going to prison, but she was entirely alone, stripped of the husband who had funded her luxurious country club lifestyle for decades. But the judge wasn't finished. The criminal sentences and the steel handcuffs had only been the appetizer. The real, catastrophic devastation was the financial execution still to come. "A prison sentence pays your debt to society," the judge declared, his heavy wooden gavel resting firmly on the sounding block. "But a prison sentence does not pay your debt to your victim. Pursuant to federal law, I am issuing an immediate, comprehensive, and non-negotiable restitution order. You are legally mandated to repay the entirety of the stolen trust fund, plus severe federal penalties, legal fees, and accumulated interest." He leaned forward, staring directly at my hyperventilating mother and my handcuffed father. "Because the thorough financial audit proves you possess essentially zero liquid capital to satisfy this massive federal debt, this court is forcefully placing both of you into immediate involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Every physical asset you possess will be aggressively seized and liquidated by a court-appointed federal trustee. Your luxury vehicles, your frozen bank accounts, your designer jewelry, and your sprawling suburban mansion will be stripped from you and put up for public sheriff's auction. Every single penny generated from the forced, humiliating sale of your entire life will be handed directly back to Riley to make her whole. You are leaving this courtroom with absolutely nothing." The federal conviction of Richard Anderson tore through the entirety of the civil litigation process like a massive, unstoppable wrecking ball. The civil court judge looked at the overwhelming mountain of criminal evidence, the blatantly forged power of attorney, the damning wiretap transcripts, and immediately granted summary judgment in my favor. There was no drawn-out legal battle, no dramatic courtroom showdown over the property deed. Just a swift, brutal, and highly efficient execution of justice. Less than 48 hours after my father traded his tailored designer suits for a standard-issue federal prison uniform, I stood in the foyer of the Vivian Cole law firm, holding a brand-new ironclad property deed bearing my name and my name alone. The transition from a freezing, flooded suburban basement to the $1.5 million Michigan Avenue penthouse felt profoundly surreal. I walked into the sprawling, echoing living room where Madison had once arrogantly hosted her fake high society gala just months before. The federal authorities and bankruptcy trustees had already swept through the premises, seizing whatever luxury furniture and electronics Terrence hadn't managed to stuff into his duffel bag before his humiliating arrest at the airport. The space was entirely bare, stripped of their toxic presence, echoing instead with the quiet, untouchable peace of absolute victory. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline, breathing in the crisp, clean air of a life finally reclaimed. The very first thing I did was hire a premium security firm to install impenetrable biometric locks on every single door. The spectacular public downfall of my father didn't just restore my stolen inheritance, it completely resurrected my professional reputation from the dead. Richard was no longer a powerful, intimidating logistics executive who could snap his fingers and destroy my livelihood through his corrupt country club network. He was a disgraced, convicted felon sitting in a concrete cell. The moment news of his severe federal sentencing hit the Chicago business journals, my silent smartphone erupted into a relentless, frantic frenzy of activity. The same corporate directors and wealthy tech clients who had once cowardly sent me cold, legally sanitized contract termination emails were now desperately clawing their way back into my good graces. My inbox flooded instantly with groveling, pathetic apologies, heavily disguised as professional misunderstandings. Executives blamed internal miscommunications, rogue human resources departments, and temporary budget constraints. They sent extravagant apology gifts, massive floral arrangements, and heavy wooden crates of vintage champagne straight to my new penthouse address, practically begging me to reinstate their user experience design contracts. They knew the power dynamic had completely shifted. I was no longer a desperate freelancer starving in a basement, terrified of losing a paycheck. I was the sole heir to a massive real estate trust fund who had just legally annihilated a prominent corporate executive without breaking a single sweat. I held absolute power, and those ruthless corporate directors could smell it on me. I did not ignore their frantic emails. I did not let them off the hook easily. I scheduled video conferences with every single director who had previously abandoned me under my father's threats. I sat in my luxurious, sunlit penthouse, looking directly into my high-definition webcam with a cold, predatory smile. I politely informed them that my independent design agency was currently accepting new corporate clients. However, I explained that my premium digital design rates had officially tripled due to overwhelming market demand and my newly elevated industry status. Not a single executive dared to negotiate or complain about the massive price hike. They eagerly signed the heavy new contracts, desperate to associate themselves with a rising, untouchable force in the digital design industry. They happily wired massive retainer fees directly into my business accounts. I was no longer just surviving the daily grind. I was building a highly lucrative, unstoppable empire directly on the ashes of my father's ruined reputation. 2 weeks into my newly reclaimed, wildly successful life, I received an urgent calendar invitation from Vivian Cole. I drove my newly purchased luxury sedan downtown and walked into her intimidating corner office. Grandpa Harrison was present via a secure video link from his sprawling estate in Florida, sipping his morning coffee with an expression of profound, undeniable grandfatherly pride. Vivian sat behind her massive mahogany desk, looking remarkably pleased with herself. She didn't have her usual towering stacks of thick civil litigation binders. Instead, a single brightly colored manila folder rested perfectly in the center of her desk. Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands neatly over the folder, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, calculated brilliance. The federal bankruptcy trustee has officially finished auditing your parents' completely decimated financial portfolio, she announced, her voice ringing with sheer lethal satisfaction. Per the strict federal restitution order handed down by the judge, the United States government is forcefully liquidating every physical asset Richard and Linda Anderson ever owned to repay the money they stole from your trust fund. They've already seized and auctioned off Linda's expensive jewelry collection, her country club shares, and the remaining luxury vehicles. Vivian slid the brightly colored folder across the polished mahogany. I opened it and stared down at a glossy, officially stamped legal notice, a public auction listing. The high-resolution photograph on the front page displayed the sprawling, custom-built suburban mansion where I had grown up. It was the exact same house where I'd been treated like a worthless afterthought while Madison was crowned the golden child. It was the ultimate towering symbol of my parents' toxic arrogance and their desperate, pathetic obsession with high society status. The federal government has officially evicted your mother, leaving her entirely homeless, and the property has been completely cleared out, Vivian said, a brilliant, calculating spark lighting up her sharp eyes. The bank is putting the mansion on the block at the Cook County Sheriff's auction next Tuesday morning because they need to liquidate it immediately to satisfy your massive federal restitution order. The opening bid is set at a terrifyingly cheap, rock-bottom price. The Cook County Sheriff's auction was held in a stark, heavily fluorescent-lit municipal building that smelled distinctly of stale coffee and administrative despair. I walked through the heavy glass double doors wearing a custom-tailored emerald green power suit that cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. My designer heels clicked with a lethal rhythmic authority against the scuffed linoleum floor. Vivian Cole walked perfectly in step beside me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing certified federal bank drafts. I was no longer the exhausted, terrified freelancer begging for scraps in a flooded suburban basement. I was an apex predator stepping directly into a room full of scavengers. The auction hall was packed tightly with aggressive real estate developers, property flippers, and bargain hunters searching for distressed assets to exploit. I scanned the crowded, noisy room and instantly spotted them cowering in the far back corner. Linda and Madison looked completely and utterly unrecognizable. The devastating reality of federal bankruptcy had brutally stripped away their arrogant country club veneer. My mother wore a faded, generic trench coat, her posture hunched, fragile, and utterly defeated. Madison stood closely beside her, looking absolutely miserable and gaunt in a cheap, unbranded sweater. They were frantically whispering to a tall, silver-haired man I immediately recognized from my childhood. Arthur Hughes, a wealthy commercial real estate developer and one of my father's most loyal former golfing buddies. My mother was desperately clinging to the sleeve of Arthur's expensive wool suit. Even from across the crowded room, I could read the pathetic, deeply delusional strategy playing out on her tear-stained face. Linda and Madison were begging him to act as a straw buyer, to purchase their foreclosed mansion at a steep discount, and quietly rent it back to them for pennies on the dollar. They were still desperately clinging to their wealthy suburban illusion, praying a high society bailout would magically save them from the brutal, incoming reality of low-income public housing. I watched with pure, glacial satisfaction as Arthur gently but firmly removed my mother's shaking hand from his expensive jacket. He took a deliberate, highly visible step backward, shaking his head with a look of intense discomfort. Nobody in the Chicago financial district wanted anything to do with the radioactive fallout of my father's massive federal fraud conviction. Arthur turned his back on them without a single word of comfort and walked quickly away, leaving Linda and Madison completely isolated in the freezing corner of the auction hall, abandoned by the very social circle they had sacrificed my entire life to impress. The auctioneer stepped up to the heavy wooden podium and adjusted the screeching microphone. The room quieted immediately as he read the legal description of the massive suburban estate. Because the property was being aggressively liquidated by the federal government to satisfy my restitution order, the starting bid was set at a terrifyingly low baseline, barely a fraction of what the custom-built mansion was actually worth on the open market. Linda let out a choked, audible sob as she heard her beloved luxury fortress priced like a cheap, abandoned foreclosure. The bidding opened rapidly. Several aggressive property flippers in the front row immediately raised their numbered paddles into the air. The price climbed steadily, but it remained incredibly low for such an affluent neighborhood. I stood perfectly still at the back of the room with Vivian, my arms crossed comfortably over my tailored green suit. I didn't move a single muscle. I simply watched my mother and sister staring frantically around the room, praying that Arthur or any of their former wealthy friends would raise a paddle to save them. Not a single person from their old high society life lifted a finger. The flippers slowly stopped bidding as the price reached their maximum profit margins. The auctioneer called out the current bid, scanning the silent room for any final challengers. Going once, going twice. I slowly uncrossed my arms and raised my bright yellow bidder's paddle high into the cold air. My voice rang out clear, sharp, and unwavering across the silent municipal hall as I called out a massive, overwhelming cash bid that instantly shattered the profit margins of every single real estate flipper in the room. The entire hall turned to stare at me. Linda and Madison's heads snapped in my direction so fast I thought their necks might break. Their eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as they finally realized exactly who was hijacking the auction. I wasn't bidding with my rapidly expanding corporate design revenue alone. I was bidding with the fully restored trust fund that my parents had desperately tried to steal from me. I was using the exact same financial weapon they had forged to destroy me. I stared directly into my mother's terrified, bloodshot eyes as the auctioneer frantically checked to see if anyone else would counter my astronomical cash offer. The property flippers shook their heads and lowered their paddles, completely intimidated by my overwhelming financial leverage. They knew a federal trust fund baby when they saw one, and they knew they could not outbid my sheer vindictive capital. The auctioneer raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air. "Sold, to the bidder in the green suit," he announced loudly, bringing the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. The hammer strike legally transferred absolute ownership of the sprawling suburban mansion directly into my hands. I had just purchased my childhood home, the grand, imposing fortress of my parents' toxic arrogance and extreme favoritism, for a shockingly cheap, severely discounted price, using the exact restitution money the federal judge had squeezed from their liquidated assets. Linda's legs gave out entirely. She collapsed against the back wall of the auction hall, sliding down to the dirty linoleum floor, weeping with loud, uncontrollable agony. Madison stood frozen above her, staring at me with a look of profound, devastating realization. They finally understood the absolute, ruthless symmetry of their punishment. They were officially homeless, and I was the sole legal owner of their ruined empire. I didn't offer them a single ounce of sympathy, not one comforting glance. I turned to Vivian, handed her my yellow bidder's paddle, and smiled a cold, victorious smile. We turned our backs on my weeping mother and my shattered sister and walked confidently out of the auction hall to finalize the paperwork on my brand new, heavily discounted real estate acquisition. 4 months passed since the auctioneer's gavel finalized my ultimate victory. I never packed a single box to move my belongings into the sprawling suburban mansion. Living inside the walls where I had been systematically abused was out of the question. I'd bought that massive estate to completely erase the toxic history it represented. I hired a commercial demolition crew on my very first day of legal ownership. I stood on the front lawn in a tailored trench coat, sipping a hot latte, watching with absolute satisfaction as heavy construction machinery rolled straight up the pristine brick driveway. I directed the demolition foreman to start with my mother's formal living room. I watched through the massive bay windows as men carrying heavy sledgehammers brutally smashed through the custom crown molding and the imported marble fireplace where Linda used to host her pretentious country club luncheons. The pristine space where I had been endlessly mocked was instantly reduced to a massive pile of jagged rubble and white drywall dust. Next came the Golden Child's sanctuary. I requested that the crew completely gut Madison's overly indulgent master bedroom suite. The expensive walk-in closet where she had hoarded designer dresses bought with my stolen trust fund money was violently torn down to the bare wooden studs. The walls were entirely knocked out, opening the compartmentalized floor plan into a sprawling modern industrial space. The physical destruction of their arrogant suburban fortress was intensely, almost unreasonably therapeutic. By the end of the 4th month, the commercial renovation was fully complete. The once hostile family mansion had been transformed into the corporate headquarters for my expanding user experience design agency. The layout was now an open, collaborative tech hub featuring sleek glass partitions, polished concrete floors, and brilliant natural sunlight pouring through the newly expanded windows where the heavy mahogany dining table used to sit. I installed a massive, high-tech conference room. I hadn't just built a beautiful office space. I'd built an entire ecosystem of opportunity, using the influx of corporate contracts I'd secured after Richard's federal fraud conviction. I aggressively expanded my business operations. I hired 36 young, brilliant digital designers and software developers, most of them talented creatives who had been unfairly overlooked by corporate firms, people who knew exactly what it felt like to grind for every single dollar they earned. I gave them excellent salaries, comprehensive health benefits, and a genuinely luxurious environment in which to build their careers. I walked through the vibrant hallways of my new agency, listening to the energetic hum of clicking keyboards and enthusiastic brainstorming sessions. My employees actively collaborated on massive digital campaigns for international tech giants, completely oblivious to the miserable history that had once stained this exact property. I had taken a monument of toxic entitlement and completely flipped it into a thriving engine of modern innovation. I was an absolute titan in my industry, sitting at the top of an empire I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. While I was aggressively scaling my design firm, Madison was experiencing a completely different reality check. The federal government had entirely liquidated her stolen assets. Terrence was locked away in a federal penitentiary, having abandoned her with a mountain of legal fees and 0 legitimate work experience. My parents were bankrupt, living in a heavily subsidized apartment in an undesirable zip code, utterly incapable of providing their golden child with any kind of financial bailout. Madison was forced into the unforgiving workforce without a fake corporate title to prop up her ego. She managed to secure employment as a waitress at a dingy coffee shop on the industrial outskirts of the city. Her daily reality now consisted of a cheap, heavily stained polyester uniform apron and scrubbing sticky tables for minimum wage. The perfectly manicured fingernails she once tapped arrogantly against her designer handbags were now chipped, ragged, and permanently smelling of cheap industrial bleach. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, Madison finished an exhausting double shift at the cafe. Her ancient used car had broken down 2 days earlier, forcing her to rely on the notoriously unreliable city bus system. She wrapped her thin, frayed coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering violently as she walked down the wet, gray sidewalk. Because of a sudden detour on her bus route, she found herself walking directly through the affluent, heavily manicured suburban neighborhood where she had spent her entire spoiled, entitled life. Madison trudged past the tall, perfectly sculpted hedges and the sprawling green lawns, her cheap sneakers soaking through with freezing puddle water. She kept her head down, utterly terrified that one of her former wealthy neighbors might drive past in a luxury vehicle and recognize the golden child reduced to a miserable, exhausted waitress. Her legs ached profoundly as she approached the familiar intersection. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath hitching painfully in her tight chest. She was standing directly in front of our old family estate. Madison stared through the heavy, custom-forged iron gates, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock and profound humiliation. The property was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, pristine facade of the mansion had been modernized with sleek architectural steel and dark-tinted glass. A row of expensive electric vehicles sat neatly parked in the completely repaved driveway. The front doors stood wide open, and stylish, successful young professionals walked in and out with briefcases and laptops. But it was the massive, brand-new sign mounted directly onto the heavy iron gates that completely broke her fragile, delusional mind. The gleaming, custom-brushed steel letters sparkled arrogantly in the cold afternoon sunlight. Madison stood on the wet, dirty sidewalk, shivering uncontrollably in her stained waitress uniform, and stared at the towering, undeniable proof of my absolute victory. The heavy metal sign proudly displayed the name of my highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar user experience design agency. It was an unmistakable, permanent monument to her total destruction. The freezing winds off Lake Michigan whipped across the massive glass balcony of the downtown Chicago penthouse. I stood near the heavy steel railing with a crystal glass of vintage red wine resting comfortably in my hand. The sprawling, glittering grid of the city stretched out infinitely below me, a breathtaking ocean of golden lights and towering skyscrapers. I was standing hundreds of feet above the dark, damp, flooded suburban basement where I had spent years desperately coding user interfaces and surviving on cheap coffee. I was finally breathing the crisp, clean air of the absolute summit. The transition from the miserable bottom of the family hierarchy to the literal top of the Chicago skyline felt like a profound, undeniable reality. I had fought tooth and nail through a brutal storm of emotional abuse, severe federal fraud, and unparalleled greed, and I had emerged entirely victorious. Grandpa Harrison sat comfortably in a custom leather armchair just a few feet away, securely wrapped in a thick wool coat against the biting evening chill. He looked incredibly peaceful, his sharp eyes reflecting the brilliant city lights. He took a slow, appreciative sip of his own wine and let out a deep, satisfied sigh. We had spent the entire afternoon reviewing the final legal documents from Vivian Cole, officially closing the book on the federal restitution and the absolute bankruptcy of my parents. The trust fund was fully restored, protected by ironclad legal barriers, and my user experience design agency was generating a massive, unprecedented amount of revenue. "You built an absolute fortress, Riley," Grandpa Harrison said, his voice carrying a heavy, resonant pride that warmed me against the freezing wind. "You didn't just survive their malicious attempts to destroy your future. You completely dismantled their fraudulent empire and used the wreckage to pave your own highway. I've spent my entire life evaluating business deals and measuring the resilience of ambitious entrepreneurs, and I can say with absolute certainty that I have never been more proud of anyone in my life." I smiled a genuine, completely unburdened smile and leaned back against the heavy glass railing. "I didn't do it entirely alone, Grandpa," I replied, holding my crystal glass up toward him. "You gave me the initial foundation, and you stood right beside me when I had to face down a federal courtroom. You showed me what actual, unconditional family support looks like." He nodded slowly, a fierce, protective glint in his elderly eyes. "You earned every single victory with your own two hands and your own brilliant mind," he stated firmly. "You used the rigid, unforgiving power of federal law to execute absolute justice. You didn't resort to their dirty, manipulative tactics. You operated with total integrity, and that is exactly why you're standing on this luxury balcony while they're facing the brutal, agonizing consequences of their own actions." Before I could respond to his profound statement, the sharp, sudden vibration of my smartphone broke the peaceful silence of the balcony. The device rested on the sleek glass patio table between us. The bright screen illuminated the dark evening, displaying a new text message from a completely unknown, unsaved phone number. I set my wine glass down next to the phone and picked up the device. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes scanning a short, desperate cluster of words. "Riley, please, it's your mother. I'm out of money for my blood pressure medicine and the public clinic is closed. Madison can't help me because she lost her waitress job yesterday. I'm freezing and I feel sick. Please, I'm begging you. Just wire me $50. Just $50 to help your mother." I stood perfectly still on the luxurious balcony, reading the pathetic, groveling message sent by a woman who had happily forged my signature to steal a $1.5 million property. I read the desperate plea of a woman who had publicly called me a worthless failure, who had ruthlessly mocked my freelance career, and who had gleefully financed my sister's arrogant lifestyle using my stolen identity. Linda was reduced to begging for $50 from an unknown prepaid phone number, shivering in whatever cheap, federally subsidized housing unit she had been forced into after her sprawling suburban mansion was auctioned off to me. Grandpa Harrison watched my face carefully, his sharp eyes catching the faint glow of the phone screen. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady and watchful. I looked away from the glowing screen and stared out at the magnificent, sprawling city skyline. I waited for the familiar, conditioned surge of childhood guilt to hit my chest. I waited for the heavy, suffocating feeling of familial obligation that had controlled my actions for 33 years. I waited to feel even a shred of pity for the woman who had given birth to me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my veins, no sadness, no regret, and absolutely no mercy. The emotional manipulation cord had been permanently severed by the gavel of a federal judge and the ruthless clarity of my own self-worth. Linda was no longer my mother. She was simply a convicted federal accessory to wire fraud who had gambled her entire life on a fake tech startup and lost everything. "No problem at all," I replied, my voice completely light and entirely free of any emotional burden. "Just a spam message." I looked down at the screen one last time. I didn't type a single letter in response. I didn't demand an apology or deliver a harsh, vindictive lecture. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, navigated to the security settings, and hit the block contact button. The unknown number instantly vanished into the digital void, permanently erased from my existence. I placed the phone face down on the glass table, completely detaching myself from the miserable, ruined lives of Richard, Linda, Madison, and Terrence. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, and I was never looking back. I picked up my glass of vintage wine and turned back to my grandfather, the cold Chicago wind whipping through my hair. I raised my glass high into the air, the crystal catching the ambient light of the penthouse. "I actually got a massive email right before we stepped out onto the balcony," I announced, a bright, victorious laugh escaping my lips. The chief executive officer of that major Silicon Valley tech firm officially signed the corporate contract. My design agency is taking over their entire global user experience overhaul. It's the biggest, most lucrative contract I've ever secured in my entire life. Grandpa Harrison's face erupted into a massive, triumphant smile. He raised his own glass, tapping it gently against mine with a crisp, melodic clink that sounded like pure, unadulterated freedom. "To the absolute top of the world, Riley," he declared, his voice full of joy. "To the top of the world," I echoed, taking a long, satisfying sip of the rich red wine. I stood on the balcony of my multi-million-dollar fortress, surrounded by the dazzling lights of the city I had conquered. I had built a massive, untouchable empire using nothing but my own brilliant mind, my relentless work ethic, and the absolute crushing power of the law. I was entirely safe, I was immensely powerful, and I was, at long last, permanently free. The most profound lesson to draw from Riley's journey is that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to exploit, manipulate, or destroy you. Society often conditions us to believe that family requires unconditional loyalty, forcing individuals to swallow their pain and sacrifice their own well-being just to maintain a fragile, toxic peace. This story, however, completely shatters that dangerous illusion. It teaches us that when abusive relatives view your empathy as weakness and your quiet resilience as an open invitation for exploitation, setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an absolute necessity for your own survival. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the undeniable, life-saving power of financial and emotional independence. Riley survived the ultimate betrayal because she spent her entire adult life building a fortress with her own two hands. By paying her own way, grinding through 70-hour work weeks in a flooded basement, and refusing to rely on her parents' highly conditional handouts, she ensured they had zero leverage over her when the truth finally came to light. True security does not come from high society status, stolen assets, or fake corporate titles. It comes from the unshakable competence, integrity, and grit you cultivate within yourself, day after day, long before anyone is watching. Finally, the story proves that the ultimate revenge is never about lowering yourself to the malicious level of your abusers. It is about stepping aside, allowing the swift and uncompromising hammer of natural consequences to fall exactly where it belongs, and focusing entirely on elevating your own life instead. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. By cutting the heavy cord of guilt and walking away from those who constantly belittle your worth, you free yourself to reach the absolute summit of your own potential. If you have ever had to break free from toxic expectations to build your own independent empire, share your story of resilience in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys.